Good afternoon and welcome to Biosphere 2 Live. My name is John Adams and this is our weekly Facebook Live post from Biosphere 2. Today I'm standing in one of our most amazing and remarkable research areas, and this is the site of the Landscape Evolution Observatory, or otherwise known as LEO. But this site has a really interesting history in that originally, when the 8 people who were sealed inside Biosphere 2 were dependent on growing their own agricultural crops, this was the space where they did that. So this space is about a ½ acre in size. Now what you're looking at here behind me is only about 1/3 of the total space. But it is a site where we have conducted and built the world's largest earth science experiment. And what I mean by that, and yeah, pardon the background noise, we've got some of our researchers doing some things down below as they conduct experiments. But what we have here is a facility that is unlike anything else in the world. So LEO was constructed out of a need to better understand some fundamental hydrologic properties. And so it rains in the mountains. How much water ends up downstream for you and I to use, and what impacts that quality as you have changes to the landscape. And so there are a lot of questions. And so this isn't looking at above ground or overland flow, but this is looking what happens subsurfacely. And so it was a group of researchers who spent nearly 2 years coming together from various disciplines. So we had a hydrologist and geologist and geomorphologist and plant biologist and ecologist and folks who put all of this information together in large global circulation models and atmospheric models in a room debating on how and what this should look like. Ultimately, they settled on an idea to design and develop a landscape that would start as a very elementary state, and then they would build complexities over time. It would also resemble something that we call a zero-order catchment. So this is the initial place where you begin to see the formation of a watershed, that initial channeling. And you can probably see that behind me, how there's a conversion zone. So in the middle of the structure behind me, it's a little bit lower, or it looks like there's a trough versus that on the sides or right behind me. And so this convergence zone was critical. And you know, many people ask, well, why is the soil black? You know, what's the purpose of that? So when the researchers were looking at, well, what type of material should we put on this structure that will help us better understand these hydrologic principles, the idea was, okay, let's test local soils. So folks from the University of Arizona research team, they went out and they took samples from a number of different areas here regionally. The challenge is that when they collected soils that were in place, it was going to be very difficult, they felt, to replicate that. Because what you're looking at is only one of 3 slopes. And they wanted to make sure that all 3 slopes were as close to identical as possible. So what they ended up settling on was a volcanic basalt material that they collected from northern Arizona. Now the reason they selected this material is it is a parent material. So it's similar, or we think of other parent materials like granite, schists, rhyolite, and so these materials are fundamental building blocks for soils, and when you weather them, they break down from these primary into secondary minerals, they release nutrients. The characteristics though of this basalt made it very highly attractive, because what happens is when you add water to it, it weathers very quickly, much faster than a lot of these other materials. And that was an ideal characteristic for our researchers, because they could actually see and monitor that weathering in a relatively short time frame, and they could look at how that transformation, those structural changes, the releases of nutrients, were going to promote the growth of microbial communities in this system. And one of the really interesting things is that although we couldn't sterilize the soil, it was relatively void of organic material. It didn't have a diverse microbial community. There were some things present, but we're actually seeing it transform and change over the short time that this has been in place. And what you're looking at behind me took nearly 6 years to actually build, and it's only been in place for about 3 years that we've been conducting experiments in it. Now, one of the big questions we get is that, okay, you've got soil there, but how does that relate to the real world? Well, what's exciting for a research perspective is that the outside world is a coupling of the physical and the biological processes. And those are stitched together, and it makes understanding what happens outside very, very complicated. Again, if you're just joining us, my name is John Adams. I'm Deputy Director here at Biosphere 2, and we're standing inside our Landscape Evolution Observatory research space, otherwise known as LEO. And so this biological and physical world are stitched together, and it makes interpreting what's happening very complicated. But if we can unstitch them and understand sort of the simple physical state, and then fold in biology, it's going to allow us to better understand how we predict some of these fundamental processes. And so what we're planning to do here in about a year is introduce vascular plants. And so we took this volcanic basalt material from northern Arizona, right around the Flagship area. We ground it up into a loamy sand from larger particles. We put it on these trays. What you can't see embedded in the trays is nearly 1,800 sensors and samplers. And then we covered those up. They are all sitting at various locations and various depths so that we get a very good understanding of what's happening spatially over this. And then we add rain, and the rain comes from the perimeter. We spent a lot of time looking at different types of sprinkler heads, how we were going to create as even of a distribution across the slope. But when you add water, that is a primary weathering force. And we see this material break down. And as a result of that breakdown, we've seen nutrient release. And that nutrient release has now fed this microbial community. And so that's really exciting for us because we're seeing it transform and change. We're looking at how the current hydrologic models do at predicting what we're observing. And again, model validation and calibration is one of the really exciting things that happens here at Biosphere 2. Because what we can do is we have systems that are larger than what you find typically in a lab, but they're not so large as what we have on the outside that we don't have any control. And it's the control of this facility and of this space and of this slope that is key for the research that we're doing. Now, this structure is essentially was built inside of here. We didn't take the top off of Biosphere. The entire structure itself is about 37 feet wide. It's almost 100 feet long, so that's a third of a football field. And for the engineers and the construction folks who built this, they equated it to building a ship in a bottle. Because what we had to do, and what you can't see, is there's one over here to the right of me, and there's one to the left of me. But we had to work our way. It's sort of like painting yourself out of a room. You don't want to paint yourself in a corner. You want to work your way out. So we had to start with the one over here on my right, build this one, and then finally build the one over on my left, and do it in that order. But for that team, it was really exciting because they've never done anything else like this. There's no blueprint for this. There's no other place in the world that has a facility like this. What you can't see below me is that this entire structure, which weighs nearly 2 million pounds, is sitting on 10 load cells. So we know exactly what the weight is. And when we rain on this system, you'll actually see a weight change. And we can detect as little as a 3 millimeter surface change of water across this, which is absolutely remarkable. The other thing is that behind me you can see these masts or towers. They tell us what's going on above the surface. And one of the important things is that we don't want anybody walking on this surface. And so what we've done is on the far end you can sort of see almost like a bridge or a crane-like structure. That holds a gantry system that allows our research team and researchers to move up and down the slope without coming in contact with the soil. Because if we were to walk across this surface, it would create disturbances that would be difficult to replicate between the other two slopes, and it also could potentially create a channel for water to move over the surface that's unlike the other two. So we want to try to remain off of the slopes as much as possible for the duration of this experiment, which is selected to run about 10 years. So what you're looking at and what I've been describing is the world's largest earth science experiment. And over the coming weeks, you're going to hear from the research team some of the different types of experiments that they're doing in here. They're going to talk about the instrumentation and the unique measurements that we can do here that we can't do anywhere else. They're going to talk about how this system is tied in with a series or a network of watersheds across the U.S. called a Critical Zone Observatory, and how that connection is critical to understanding and better informing us. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, LEO, the Landscape Evolution Observatory, is a crucial tool in trying to understand how the changes in landscapes influence the amount of water that rains on the mountains, how much of that ends up downstream for you and I to use, and what impacts that quality. And as this landscape changes and evolves, how in turn does that drive those processes and change those processes. So again, thank you very much for joining us for Facebook Live. If there are any questions, we're happy to take those at this time. Otherwise, if you have an opportunity to watch this at a later date on our YouTube channel, please do go ahead and post on our Facebook page, and we'll try to get back and answer any questions that you may have. And again, look out for us in coming weeks as we and feature Leo on future Biosphere 2 live posts.